Welcome everyone to this new episode of the Privacy Rules, Privacy Espresso. The topic of today is about synthetic data, what they are and which are their possible use and implications. And we are going to do that with an expert on the topic, that is Luca Egitto from the Italian law firm RP Legal and Tax, that will provide us with an overview on all those points. Luca, thanks a lot for being with us today.
Oh, thanks to you, and thanks for inviting me again and to discuss this wonderful topic.
Perfect. So looking forward to know a bit more about it. And just to give our audience an overview, what are synthetic data?
So synthetic data are data that derive from a process which is applied to an original data set, which is deprived of those features that allow to identify a data subject, but at the same time preserved statistical properties. So it's fake data, but at the same time they preserve the original value from a statistical and analytic standpoint. So they became very popular because of GDPR, but also because of AI. Belong to both matters of discussion. So synthetic data is the result of synthesis, which is using also artificial intelligence to change a data set so that after synthesis, this data set can no longer be reconnected to an identifiable person. At the same time, this whole data set is still very useful for statistical and analytic purposes. Why it became popular? For two reasons. The first one, it is to some extent similar, if not entirely, a pseudonymization technique. To some extent, it's also akin or close to being an anonymous data. So it can prompt basically the non-application of GDPR if properly made. So on the one hand, it's a technical and organizational measure to protect personal data. To another extent, it's a way to fall out of scope regarding GDPR. Why is this palatable for businesses? On the one hand, it's a very effective way to make data non-intelligible. So it's a security measure, very good to meet the requirements of Article 32 of GDPR. On the other hand, it makes data lakes marketable, because if they are no longer identifiable, if all this information is outside the scope of GDPR, then it can be traded and marketed as a commodity. So this makes synthetic data very interesting. However, there are ups and downs. And if you're familiar with the issues of anonymization, then we are pretty much in the same area of uncertainty, because if you want to preserve the most of the statistical properties, then the synthesis may end up with a data set which in theory can still be reconnected to the original data subject. So you have a trade-off between privacy and utility. It's very interesting. It's on the rise, but still there's not a silver bullet for every application.
Perfect, very clear. And thanks a lot for this. It seems something very complex, but you explained it in an easy way, let's say. You made it easier to understand what we are talking about. And speaking about this, which are, in your view, potential implication? I'm thinking, for example, about how those can be used on marketing or for machine learning, that are two big topics of the moment related to that.
So it can be used in both areas. I think that machine learning is, by definition, the most effective example of how synthetic data can be used, because machine learning needs a lot of information to be trained, and you need to feed the machine with a lot of information, and to have a proper learning, then you need to mimic real life. So feeding the machine with synthetic data that mimic real life personal data is a very effective way to train these large language models.
So sorry, Luca, to interrupt. To give you an example, this would work, for example, with ChatGPT or
so if you want to,
like that one.
Yeah, if you want to train ChatGPT or another language model in a privacy-friendly manner, then you should feed the system with synthetic data. On the other end, you mentioned marketing. True. So in marketing, statistics are essential, because you can market your product much, much better if you know your audience. But again, you have privacy implications. And using synthetic data can allow businesses to understand the shape, the features of their clients without framing one specific individual without identifying individual. This is something which already occurred because, for example, Google has data sets which are pseudonymized, so are not referred to a specific person, but the issue with Google is that it can re-identify individuals using the other information it retains.
Yeah.
So it certainly is very effective for these two features, but another feature, which is highly recommended, is using them as a technical measure to preserve protection of personal data, for example, in test environments or in maintenance environments. So for example, when you test software, you develop a computer program and you need to test and to make a number of trials into a real-time and real-life data set in order to have a proper testing. But normally, you don't have legal grounds to process personal data for this kind of activity. So what you should do in this case is convert the environment into a synthetic data environment where you can basically carry out R&D and testing of your software. At the same time, if you are, let's say, a service provider engaged to provide maintenance to a specific environment of your client, then you should not read and access the personal data that you find. You should just focus on fixing the bugs of a software that you have supplied. But sometimes this is not feasible without accessing personal information. Just let's make an example that I am a plumber and I'm required to fix a problem in this room, right? And so let's say that you have personal information plastered all around the walls. Now I'm required to make something which has nothing to do with personal data. At the same time, I just can't blind myself to this personal data unless the owner of the premises masks this personal data so that I access a place where this information is not recognizable to an individual. This is a potential very useful use of synthetic data. It's not potential because businesses are already using it.
Sounds extremely interesting. And in that regard, I have just one last question for you. Do you see synthetic data as a potential solution in relation to topics like data transfer between EU and US? We know that one of the key problems is exactly the fact that those big companies are often capable of going back and singling out the information of people. Would it work? What do you think about that?
The fact that an importer in the US can basically access and recognize personal data per se is not the biggest problem, because using a contract under Article 28 and the SECs, you can have a contractual obligation from this importer not to use this data further to the engagement that they had from the exporter. The issue comes from the authorities that may carry out investigations and then can compel importers to reveal personal data and also to reveal the information necessary to read these data. So synthetic data can be one of those additional safeguards which the EDPB recommended, but at the same time is not different from encryption at rest. Data is encrypted or are converted into synthetic data, but the importer still has the keys or the information to re-identify. Then these keys or re-identification means can be compelled for disclosure by the authorities. So again, it could be for sure an additional safeguard, but it needs to be bulletproof and not penetrable by the US authorities to work as a final solution to export.
Perfect. It's going to be then a good measure, but together with others that needs to be taken.
Yeah, so if we read the whole picture, then we know because of this recent ECJ that if we have pseudonymous data to an entity which has no means to add specific information suitable to re-identified, then they are anonymous for this organization, right? So if we meet these criteria, then again, we are safe. But then it depends where this data ends up. Because if they end up, again, at Google or Microsoft, these entities have so many information that it is practically impossible to argue that they are prevented from re-identify individuals. So it's challenging, but definitely it's a giant step forward in protecting personal data.
Thank you very much for providing us with those further details and explanation on what synthetic data are. Seems something extremely interesting. So thank to you, thank to our audience for being with us today, and looking forward to the next Privacy Espresso. Bye, Luca.
Thank you.